Bar Brewery Tour. That one's just a little while. But welcome to Cascade. My name's Ellie. I'll be taking you through your tour today. Now we will be covering some very old grounds, almost 200 years old. So there is just a bit of safety brief just to go over really quickly. So I'd like to start off the tour just with a little bit of a question in particular. But does anyone know the European name for Tasmania? Yeah, absolutely. So Van Diemen's Land is what Tasmania used to be called. That name in particular was going haywire across Europe in the early 1800s, so much so that it came across the ears of a man by the name of Peter de Graves. Now Peter de Graves, he was a nobleman and he was running many businesses up in his hometown of Dover in England. He was an engineer, an architect and a shipbuilder, but he was a dodgy man and a lot of those businesses didn't exactly run smoothly for him. And he ended up accumulating £150,000 worth of debt, which today calculates to be around 45 million Australian dollars, so a fair bit of cash. So when he heard of this place, Van Diemen's Land, he thought it was a perfect opportunity to escape all those debts. So he built his own boat, named it the Hope, chucked his family on board and they made their way here to Van Diemen's Land. They arrived in 1824 and that's the year that he would go to establish what you see today. What you do see today, it didn't begin as a brewery, it actually began as a sawmill. Now this sawmill, it ran for roughly 8 years, but in the first 3 years of getting it up and running as a company, it was interrupted as his debts were back in Dover. They crawled their way back to him, and he was sent to jail just down in Hobart, where he would go to spend 5 years in there. Now while he was in jail, he was left with a significant amount of time to think, and that's when he came up with the idea of the brewery itself. Now I was hearing stories from prisoners, specifically about the water that was running directly into Hobart and how it was being polluted by businesses like the Female Factory and different types of brickworks. If you're not aware of what the Female Factory is, it was a jail for females back in those days. So they were polluting it with some pretty gross stuff. Leaving that water really contaminated, also leaving Hobart with no fresh drinking source whatsoever. So it made him realise that his company was already that far up on that stream of water, so it was yet to be polluted. Freshest water in Australia. So when he got out of jail in 1832, he decided he would take advantage of that rivulet, brew it, bottle it and make a profit out of it. And that's where his brewery really took over from there. So I'd like to draw your attention to this white building in particular, as that's our cidery. So it's where we make all of our ciders here at Cascade. It used to be our fruit juice and cordial manufacture back in the day. So we used to make all different types of beverages. We used to make ginger ale, apple ale, blackcurrant, make some strange things like cola champagne as well. But we were bought out by Coca-Cola in 2014. They didn't buy us directly as a brewery, they just bought that name that you see up there. That way they're still able to make bottles of ginger beer, lemon lime and bitters using our name. It has like a white logo on it. You can find it at your local IGAs and airports. We just have nothing to do with it whatsoever. So it's not made here at Cascade and it's not made by us either. So it's made in New South Wales under Coca-Cola. So we are primarily committed to making alcohol. So we make mercury cider, which is around 2.4 standard drinks each. We also make like the berry syrups and stuff like that. But I also like to mention this building here as it also was heavily affected in 1967. Sorry. If you're not aware, we had really significant bushfires in 1967, destroying 75% of our brewery and killing 62 people all up around. So this road in front of you guys here, when Peter de Graves established that sawmilling business, he actually dammed off this road and he redirected the rivulet, which is just behind the brewery, directly into this dam. That way he could divert that water across site to power his sawmilling business. So here is a photo, it's a very poor quality photo, but of what that kind of looked like. And if you're not aware, back in the day, this was the only road used to get up to Mount Wellington. So blocking it off, he was really blocking that way up to get to Mount Wellington back in those days. But when Peter de Graves arrived here and he started building his sawmilling business, he actually illegally built on this land. So this was not his land whatsoever. It was owned by another man, but he just started illegally building on it. And he actually went to the local governor and he bribed the governor in changing his name to his name on the certificate, saying that he actually owned this land. He did not whatsoever. This guy that did originally own this land obviously realised that Peter de Graves was building on it, and he took Peter de Graves to court and tried to fight for that land back. He ended up leaving the court with $300 and his land was gone. Peter de Graves, because he had already built on the land, there was absolutely nothing they could do. But Peter de Graves, he was granted 200 convicts when he arrived, and that would help him build what you see today. I like to mention the sandstone. You can see every individual pig mark within each of the bricks. Each convict often had a signature pig mark, so they had a little bit of recognition and a little bit of individuality as well, which is nice. So like I said, that road in front of you guys there, it was blocked off by Peter de Graves, meaning there wasn't really a way to get up to Mount Wellington. So he actually made the main road, he redirected the road to go right through his brewery, and that way people would be able to make their way up to Mount Wellington. Now, pretty smart marketing from Peter de Graves, because really when people went through they had no choice but to grab themselves a keg on the way past. I like to bring up this bell that just sits here as well. Now that bell used to ring 4 times a day, and it'll ring for 15 minutes each time. Any guesses to what that may have indicated for our brewers? Yeah, absolutely. So when that bell would ring, like I said, it rang 4 times a day for 15 minutes, and it indicated that all of our brewers, they could stop what they were doing, and they could make their way over to our pub, which used to sit inside the brewery, and they could drink as much beer as they liked within those 15 minutes, 4 times a day. Now 15 minutes, it isn't a huge amount of time, so you can imagine them sculling as much beer as they could. It was reported that they were drinking around 10 7-ounce glasses of 12% beer. For reference, that's equivalent to 2 bottles of wine. Times that by 4, it's happening 4 times a day, and you're looking at 8 bottles of wine per brewer. Now, you can imagine it getting pretty chaotic in there, obviously handling heavy machinery, but in saying that, there was only 1 reported incident during that whole period of time. Now that is reported, they probably were too intoxicated to write the rest of them, but a man, he actually did fall down an elevator shaft in the brewery. He fell 2 stories down, he hit our second cellar, he bounced, climbed his way back up, and he went straight back to work. Now, if he hadn't have had a drop of alcohol in him, maybe it would have been a different ending. But when he did make his way back up the shaft, he didn't want to tell anyone, because he didn't want to run the risk of losing his job, as workers' comp was yet to be a thing back in those days. Now, any guesses to what year that came to a stop here at Cascade? It started in 1832, so it started when we established. So it came to a stop in 1993. It's actually the year that Colton United bought us as a company. So they came here directly on site and they saw it for themselves, saw everyone staggering and thought it wasn't really a good look, so they did put a stop to it. Now, as you can imagine, all of our brewers went on strike, fair enough. So CUB had to think of a way to bring all their brewers back in. So what they do today is that bell up there does still ring. It rings at 4 PM and it rings every Friday, and it indicates that all of our brewers can stop what they're doing once again. They can make their way over to our bar and restaurant across the road, and they can drink as much beer as they like from 4 PM to 9 PM for free, so a solid 5 hours of free drinking. But they also get to take home their slab on top of that every Friday as well. So treated fairly well. That slab can be any beer under Colton United, so it could be VB, Great Northern. It doesn't just have to be Cascade beer. Just whatever we're currently brewing. Or they can have cider if they prefer cider as well. But we have a really important man. He comes around from our office over there. He goes under where that bell is. He manually rings it. We call him Quasimodo. He's probably got the most important job here at Cascade. And you can imagine the backlash he'd get if he wasn't on time. So firstly, I like to bring you guys down here because this is our rivulet. This is where we get all of our water source from today to be making our beers at Cascade. Now, it is probably the freshest water in Australia. It is sourced from Mount Wellington, so this rivulet goes all the way up to the springs. I'd like to bring this up to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Palawa people. This area in particular was prime real estate for these people. Super dense, super protected, such a beautiful environment. But Peter de Graves, he also thought it was prime real estate for that sawmilling business. Now, as you can see here, This is the water wheel that he used during his sawmilling business, which was actually placed right where that tin shed is that you see just over there. Now, when Peter de Graves arrived here, like I said, his business started as a sawmill, so it didn't start as the brewery. He actually started up this sawmill with his brother-in-law, Hugh McIntosh. So they shared 50-50 profits of the sawmill. So when Peter de Graves got sent to jail, Hugh McIntosh kept that sawmill running, but he also paid off every single cent of those debts that Peter de Graves had accumulated, meaning that he was only in there for those 5 years. When Peter de Graves was released from jail, Hugh McIntosh passed away 5 years later, and all of his profits were meant to go to his kids up in India during that time. But Peter de Graves went ahead of himself and took all of Hugh McIntosh's profits, leaving Hugh McIntosh's children to pass away up in India from being pauper. So he's a bit of a con artist. He's definitely not the nicest man. But luckily enough for Peter de Graves, he went on to be one of the most successful families in the whole of Australia. They went on to go and build the Theatre Royal, which is actually just down in Hobart. It's the oldest theatre in Australia. And his brothers also went on to build a fleet of 12 ships as well. So very successful, but definitely not a good family whatsoever.
And a couple of new stories.
Yeah, exactly. So initially it did start as those first 3 levels. So if you look at the first 3 levels compared to the rest, you can see a significant difference in sandstone. So the first 3 levels, you have some really traditional hand-picked convict sandstone, and then above that it's much more modern, it's a lot more smoother. So in 1927, a man by the name of Gustavus Beckley, he was a manager during this period of time, and he actually ordered a large piece of machinery from Switzerland, which was far too big to fit inside the brewery. So he had to build those 4 extra levels on top of that piece of machinery, specifically to accommodate it. Now, if you look at the window, or the second level to the top, and the window closest to us, it's got the windows open, you can see directly behind it, and you may notice there's actually no room behind that wall whatsoever. So it is just a facade, purely just placed there for symmetry, so the building doesn't look uneven.
Wasn't it a sawmill in 1824?
Exactly right. So it says the oldest brewery in Australia established 1824, which is incorrect. We were not established as a brewery until 1832. But even if it were to say established in 1832, it still would be correct. We still would be the oldest brewery in Australia. Now I'll quickly show you a photo of what the brewery did used to look like before we had that extension. So it looks quite innocent. Looks kind of just like a nice farmhouse almost. And then after that extension, when they added those extra top levels, really gave it a gothic type of eerie look. It definitely doesn't look like a brewery. I'd say it looks more like an orphanage or something like a haunted mansion. Alright, so I like to mention these 2 barrels that sit up on top of that sandstone there. Any guesses to what they are made out of? They're made out of what they're sitting on, so they're made out of sandstone. They were carved by a convict roughly around 190 years ago, and he got no recognition for it and no credit for it whatsoever. So he has carved his initials just above where it says established on the barrel over there. On your other barrel, you have carved in C and J de Graves. You may be wondering who they were, but they were Peter de Graves' 2 eldest sons, Charles and John. So when Peter de Graves passed away, the brewery was handed down to those sons. But they were playboys, they were bachelor boys, they never settled down and they never had children. Meaning that when they passed away, there was no one to hand the brewery to. So it sat in the hands of the state for roughly around 3 years, until a Scottish man by the name of John Syme, he came and bought up the place. Now the first 2 things he did when he arrived here at Cascade was he put putty over the names on those barrels. He hated Peter de Graves. He heard all the nasty stuff that he had did, and he wanted him to have no correlation with the brewery whatsoever. He also changed the name of the brewery. It used to be called De Graves Brewery, and he's the one that made that change to Cascade Brewery in 1881. Now, John Syme, he was also quite successful whilst he spent his time in Tasmania. He went on to build and fund 42 hotels just down in Hobart. And he also made this not so excellent idea of having a 2-story tram line that he built directly to stop outside his house and in town as well. Now this tram line was responsible for 63 deaths. Now, as you can imagine, being 2 stories, it did often topple over, and it took a few topples for them to realise that they should probably put it to a stop. Now, John Syme, he loved his job so much here at Cascade that he actually wrote in his will that he wanted to be buried on site. Now, unfortunately, he is not buried on site. He's buried roughly around 6 minutes down the road at Queenborough Cemetery. Now, if you went to go find this cemetery, you would not be able to. It is now a football field and a school. All the bodies do lay below that oval still. The only thing that has been removed are those headstones. So when it was being made into the football field, his granddaughter had his headstone removed and popped it on site for us just for a little bit of memory. If his body were to be below there, we would have to shut down as a brewery. We'd also have to shut down our bar and restaurant across the road just because it is within that 200 metres of the body, just due to contaminated soil and also being a historic site, so just out of respect as well. To finish up, I'd like to mention this hop cart here. Now this is the original hop cart that would go up to Bushy Park to retrieve all of our hops and would come back to Cascade. If you're not aware of what hops are, they are a main ingredient in your beer. They're pretty hard to describe. They're like a bud. They come off a vine. They're green. They give your hops. They give your beer all of its flavours. So all of its bitterness, all of its hoppiness, sometimes fruitiness as well. So this hop cart would go up to Bushy Park to retrieve those hops, and it was used up until 1950, which is pretty funny considering trucks were in fact invented back then. But it is in pretty decent condition, I'd say, considering how long it was used for. But that does conclude our tour today. Thank you guys for coming along. I hope you learned something.